A journey through the Syrian Desert, where secrets lie buried, and a murder awaits to be uncovered. But who can you trust when every passenger is hiding something? What would you do if a journey turned into a deadly trap? In the endless Syrian desert, where the horizon blurs into a shimmering mirage and time seems suspended, the secrets people carry weigh heavier than the sand. A solitary Pullman motor coach rumbled along the uneven terrain, its wheels fighting against the encroaching storm. Overhead, dark clouds gathered like silent conspirators, while the distant growl of thunder warned of chaos brewing in the skies. Inside the coach, the passengers sat in uneasy silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts or perhaps their own secrets. The air inside felt heavy, a sharp contrast to the vast, oppressive openness outside. The dim light of the oil lamps swayed with the motion of the coach, casting flickering shadows that made faces look as if they were wearing masks. Captain Smethurst sat near the back, his posture stiff, his eyes darting to the window and then back to his clasped hands. He was a man who seemed to fold into himself, as though he feared the world might see too much if he didn't. He whispered to himself, low enough that no one could hear the words clearly. Yet one phrase seemed to slip out, cutting through the hum of the engine. Some secrets must never see the light. Across from him, a young woman, Netta Price, glanced up at the sound of his voice. Her wide, curious eyes met Smethurst's for a fleeting moment before he turned away, tightening his grip on his leather briefcase. Her aunt, sitting beside her, scolded her softly for staring, but Netta couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. The storm outside was growing closer now, the first drops of rain streaking the dusty windows. The driver muttered a curse under his breath as the coach jolted over a deep rut, causing one of the passengers, a burly man in a military uniform, to spill his tea. He swore loudly, his accent betraying his RAF background, and wiped his trousers with a grumble. General Poley, seated near the front, gave a pointed cough, his dark eyes sweeping over the group with a calm that bordered on calculation. He adjusted the collar of his coat, a faint smirk playing on his lips as if he were quietly entertained by the unfolding drama. "Storm's rolling in fast," the driver called out, his voice tinged with both worry and resignation. "Might get tricky up ahead." Smethurst flinched at the driver's words, his breathing quickening almost imperceptibly. He shifted in his seat, clutching his briefcase even tighter, as if it were the only thing anchoring him. Detective Parker Pyne, seated inconspicuously near the center of the coach, watched it all with a practiced eye. He noticed the beads of sweat forming on Smethurst's brow despite the cool air inside. He caught the slight tremor in the man's hands, the way his lips moved as if rehearsing a silent argument. To an untrained observer, Smethurst might have seemed like any other nervous traveler. But to Pyne, the man was puzzily a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. The storm unleashed its fury just as the coach crested a dune, the rain now pelting the windows with relentless force. Lightning illuminated the desert for a brief second, revealing the vast emptiness that seemed to stretch into eternity. Yet inside the coach, the atmosphere was anything but empty. Secrets had a way of filling spaces, and in that moment, the Pullman motor coach felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And as Captain Smethurst whispered one last cryptic sentence to himself, "Not until Baghdad," the storm wasn't the only thing about to break. Curiosity hook. The scene ends with Pyne's gaze fixed on Smethurst, his thoughts interrupted by a sudden jolt as the coach hits another bump. This journey, Pyne thought, will not end as it began. The suspense begins. The rain came down in torrents, transforming the desert into a muddy quagmire. The once solid sand turned to slush, and the Pullman motor coach groaned in protest as its wheels spun helplessly. Inside the vehicle, the passengers exchanged uneasy glances as the engine sputtered and died, leaving only the sound of rain drumming against the roof, and the occasional rumble of thunder to fill the silence. "This blasted rain will be the end of us," grumbled the driver, throwing his cap on the dashboard. "We'll have to get out and push. Ain't no other way." General Poirot sighed dramatically. "Marvelous. Just what this journey needed. Muddy boots and pneumonia." Netta Price looked at her aunt, who was clutching her handbag, as though it might somehow protect her from the storm outside. "Aunt Sylvia, maybe we should." "We are not stepping into that filth," Aunt Sylvia declared, her voice sharp. "Let the men handle it." Detective Pyne remained silent, his eyes drifting to the back of the coach where Captain Smethurst sat, his head tilted slightly forward, his hand still gripping his briefcase. The man hadn't moved since the coach had stopped. The driver turned to the passengers, his frustration boiling over. "All right, listen up. If we're going to get this coach moving again, I'll need a few hands. You, sir." He pointed at the burly RAF officer. "And you, Mr. What's your name?" "Hensley," the man replied curtly, rising from his seat. "Let's get this over with." As the driver and a handful of passengers stepped out into the storm, Pyne noticed something peculiar. Smethurst, usually quick to grumble or complain, hadn't so much as stirred. Pyne leaned forward slightly. "Captain Smethurst," he called. The man didn't respond. Outside, the scene was a chaotic mess of voices and splashing water. The men grunted and cursed as they pushed against the coach, their boots sinking into the wet sand. The rain soaked through their clothes, and the desert wind cut like a knife. "Put your back into it," the driver shouted over the downpour. Inside, Pyne's voice grew firmer. "Captain Smethurst, are you all right?" Netta turned in her seat, her brow furrowed. "Is he sleeping?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Pyne stood and moved toward the back of the coach. The closer he got, the colder the air seemed to feel. "Captain Smethurst," he said again, reaching out to touch the man's shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the captain's coat, Pyne froze. Smethurst's body was unnaturally rigid, like stone beneath the fabric. Pyne's hand recoiled instinctively as a chill ran down his spine. He leaned in, peering at the man's face. Smethurst's eyes were open, wide with an expression of sheer terror. His mouth hung slightly ajar, as though he'd tried to scream but couldn't. The briefcase he had been clutching so tightly now rested limply in his lap, his fingers still curled around its handle. Pyne's voice was low, but the urgency was clear. "Netta, call the others, now." Netta hesitated, her lips trembling. "What's wrong? Is he?" "Call them," Pyne repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Netta bolted to the door and shouted into the storm. "Come back. Something's wrong." The passengers scrambled back into the coach, dripping wet and shivering. The driver was the first to speak. "What's all this shouting about?" His words died in his throat as his eyes fell on Smethurst's motionless form. "What in God's name?" General Poirot muttered, stepping closer, his usual air of superiority replaced by unease. The RAF officer, still catching his breath, let out a low whistle. "Dead, isn't he?" Aunt Sylvia clutched her chest. "Oh, dear heavens, how did this happen?" Pyne stepped back, his gaze still fixed on Smethurst's frozen expression. "He's been dead for a while," he said quietly, "and it wasn't natural." The group fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them like the storm outside. The driver shook his head, his face pale. "What do you mean, not natural? He was fine just a moment ago." Pyne's voice was calm but firm. "Look at his face. That's not the look of a man who passed peacefully. That's fear, pure, unrelenting fear." As the rain hammered against the roof, a sense of dread settled over the passengers. Each one of them glanced at the others, suspicion creeping into their eyes. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the coach, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would change everything. Pyne turned to the group, his tone grim. "We're not just stranded in this desert, we're trapped with a murderer. The suspects and clues." The atmosphere inside the coach was thick with tension, each passenger casting uneasy glances at one another. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but the real storm was brewing within, fueled by fear and suspicion. Detective Pyne, seated at the edge of his seat, watched the group carefully, his sharp eyes noting every twitch, every whispered word, and every shift in body language. He knew from experience that people revealed their true selves in moments like these. Netta Price sat beside her aunt, wringing her hands nervously. Her youthful face was pale, her wide eyes darting between the lifeless body of Captain Smethurst and the other passengers. Beside her, Aunt Sylvia sat upright, her posture as stiff as the pins holding her tightly wound bun in place. Her lips were pursed, her sharp gaze moving around the room with the precision of a hawk. "This is absolutely preposterous," Aunt Sylvia declared, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "A murder in the middle of the desert. It's unthinkable." "Unthinkable, but real," Pyne said evenly, his calm tone contrasting with her rising pitch. "And we must now think about why someone would want Captain Smethurst dead." "Why someone?" Aunt Sylvia's eyes narrowed. "Why not a heart attack, or—" "Because that man's face," General Poley interrupted, gesturing toward the body, "does not scream heart attack, madam. It screams terror." The group fell silent for a moment, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air. Netta shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her aunt. "Netta," Pyne said suddenly, his gaze fixed on her. She startled, as though caught off guard. "You've been quiet. Did you notice anything unusual about Captain Smethurst?" "Me?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I didn't really talk to him." "Of course she didn't," Aunt Sylvia interjected, her tone protective but sharp. "I've told her time and again not to involve herself with strangers. It's hardly appropriate for a young woman of her standing." "And yet," Pyne countered smoothly, "you, madam, seemed to have quite an interest in him earlier. I couldn't help but notice you watching him when he boarded the coach. Anything you'd like to share?" Aunt Sylvia's cheeks flushed with indignation. "I was merely observing." The man was fidgeting like a nervous schoolboy, quite unbecoming for someone of his position. "But that hardly makes me a suspect." "Perhaps not," Pyne said with a faint smile. "But you do seem to be very aware of his behavior. Did you hear him say anything unusual?" "Well," Aunt Sylvia hesitated, clearly flustered. "He did mutter something under his breath as he passed by. Something about keeping secrets. But that's hardly evidence of foul play." "It's a start," Pyne said, leaning back slightly. "Secrets often have a way of leading to trouble." Netta, still wringing her hands, finally spoke up. "Aunt Sylvia doesn't mean any harm. She's just protective." "Protective of what?" Pyne asked, his gaze shifting to her. Netta froze, her face flushing pink. "Nothing, I mean, just of me. She worries about me, that's all." Aunt Sylvia let out a sharp breath. "This is nonsense. Why waste time questioning us when the real killer could be anyone else here?" She turned to the RAF officers. "What about those two? Military men always have their secrets, don't they?" The larger of the two officers, Sergeant Loftus, raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold accusation, madam. Careful you don't say something you might regret." "Oh, don't try to intimidate me," Aunt Sylvia snapped. "You are not as clever as you think." Pyne's voice cut through the rising tension. "Enough." His tone was firm but calm, restoring a measure of order. "We'll get to everyone in due time. For now, let's stick to what we know. Captain Smethurst was nervous, spoke of keeping secrets, and was clearly afraid of something for someone." The passengers fell silent again, the weight of suspicion pressing down on them all. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, the sound of rain against the coach's roof punctuating the heavy atmosphere inside. Pyne glanced at Netta and her aunt once more, his mind racing. There was something there. He was certain of it, something hidden beneath Aunt Sylvia's stern facade and Netta's nervous energy. And whatever it was, it would soon come to light. As he prepared to move on to the next set of passengers, Pyne's sharp mind was already piecing together the puzzle, one subtle clue at a time. The desert outside might have been vast and unforgiving, but the real battlefield was here, within the confines of this small, crowded coach. The RAF officers, Hensley, General Poley, and Williamson. The suspects unfold. Detective Pyne folded his hands, leaning back slightly as he took in the group before him. Each person carried a story. It was just a matter of digging deep enough to uncover it. The desert might have been vast and desolate, but the secrets inside this coach were layered and tangled, waiting to be unraveled. His sharp gaze first fell upon the two RAF officers, Flight Lieutenant James Carr and Sergeant Loftus. They were seated together, speaking in low murmurs that stopped abruptly as Pyne approached. "Gentlemen," Pyne said, his tone polite but probing, "you seem to be getting along rather well with Captain Smethurst earlier. Did you know him personally?" Carr shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, sir. Met him for the first time on this journey. Seemed a bit jumpy, if you ask me." Loftus added with a chuckle, though it felt forced. "Probably wasn't used to being around military men. We tend to make people nervous." Pyne raised an eyebrow. "Nervous, perhaps, but scared stiff. That's a different matter altogether. Did he say anything to you that might explain his demeanor?" Loftus exchanged a glance with Carr before answering. "Not much, just that he was on his way to Baghdad for some urgent business. Didn't elaborate." "Odd, isn't it?" Pyne mused aloud. "Someone so nervous, yet choosing to travel in the company of strangers, makes you wonder what or who he was afraid of." Carr shifted in his seat, his hand running over the brim of his cap. "You are barking up the wrong tree, Detective. We had nothing to do with whatever happened to him. We're just trying to get to Baghdad and do our jobs." Pyne's eyes lingered on them a moment longer before moving on. "Of course, but if you recall anything at all, I trust you'll let me know." He turned his attention to Hensley, the government official who sat rigidly with a briefcase resting against his leg. His suit was immaculate, his demeanor cold and precise, like a man accustomed to control. "Mr. Hensley," Pyne began, "your work in Baghdad must be quite important, considering you are traveling through such a treacherous route. Infrastructure, was it?" Hensley gave a curt nod. "Yes, roads, bridges, irrigation projects. The foundation of civilization, Detective. Unlike this," he added, gesturing vaguely at the storm outside. "This is chaos." "And yet," Pyne said, his voice measured, "chaos has a way of exposing cracks, doesn't it? Even in the strongest foundations." Hensley's jaw tightened. "If you are implying something, Detective, I suggest you speak plainly." "Oh, I am merely curious," Pyne replied smoothly. "You must meet all sorts of people in your line of work. Perhaps you've crossed paths with Captain Smethurst before." "No," Hensley said sharply, "and I fail to see why you are asking me these questions. My work has nothing to do with this unfortunate incident." Pyne's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Work and life have a way of intersecting unexpectedly, Mr. Hensley. But I'll leave you to think on that." As Pyne moved on, he felt the weight of Hensley's glare on his back. Next, his attention turned to General Poley. The man sat apart from the group, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. There was an air of quiet authority about him, but also something evasive, as if he were accustomed to operating in shadows. "General Poley," Pyne said, taking the seat across from him, "a man of your stature must have seen his fair share of unusual situations." Poley looked up slowly, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Unusual, yes, but this." He gestured toward Smethurst's lifeless body. "This is something else entirely." "Perhaps," Pyne said. "But tell me, General, what brings you to Baghdad? It's not often one encounters a man with your reputation on such a modest journey." Poley's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Reputation, you say? I am afraid my reputation is far more mundane than the tales you've likely heard. I am merely an observer these days, Detective. An observer? Pyne leaned forward slightly. Of what exactly? Polly's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. Of life, Detective. Of the world as it changes. Isn't that what we all are in the end? Pyne held his gaze for a moment before standing. Perhaps. But some of us leave larger footprints than others. Finally, Pyne approached Williamson, a quiet man who had been sitting near Smethurst before his death. Williamson's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his expression one of barely contained anxiety. "Mr. Williamson," Pyne said gently, "I understand you might have overheard Captain Smethurst saying something earlier. Can you tell me what it was?" Williamson swallowed hard, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, Detective. It's just, he seemed so agitated. He kept muttering to himself, saying, 'I'll stay silent until Baghdad.'" Pyne's brow furrowed. "Did he say anything else? Anything at all?" Williamson hesitated, then shook his head. "Number just that. But here is one more thing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a torn piece of paper. "I found this near his seat." Pyne took the paper, studying it closely. It was a page from an old Etonian yearbook, the edges frayed and stained. A faint inscription on the bottom caught his eye. "To my oldest friend, never forget." The room seemed to grow quieter as Pyne folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. His mind raced with possibilities. Smethurst's cryptic words, the torn page, the cast of characters, all pieces of a puzzle that promised danger and intrigue at every turn. Outside, the storm howled, but inside, the storm of secrets was only just beginning. Twists and revelations, secrets, begin to unravel. The storm outside raged on, the wind battering the stranded coach as Detective Pyne knelt beside Captain Smethurst's lifeless body. The room was thick with tension, each passenger's gaze shifting nervously as Pyne examined the corpse with meticulous precision. "What are you looking for, Detective?" Hensley's voice broke the silence, sharp and impatient. "Answers, Mr. Hensley," Pyne replied without looking up, his tone calm but pointed. "And if I am correct, they're written on this man's body." A collective murmur rippled through the group. Pyne gently adjusted Smethurst's collar, revealing what he had been searching for, a faint puncture wound on the side of his neck. "There," Pyne said, his voice grave as he stood. "This was no accident. Smethurst was killed deliberately and precisely." Gasps echoed around the coach. Netta Price clung to her aunt, her face pale. "But how? Who would do such a thing?" "That, Miss Price," Pyne said, his sharp gaze scanning the room, "is the question we must answer before the killer strikes again." Loftus, the RAF officer who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Detective. You are suggesting someone among us is capable of murder." Pyne's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Capable? Certainly. And if we're being honest, Lieutenant Loftus, I suspect you know more about this than you are letting on." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Loftus. His face darkened, but he held his composure. "You think I had something to do with this?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with defensiveness. "I think," Pyne said, his tone razor-sharp, "that you are a man who's seen his share of violence, and you understand the psychology of fear, don't you? Perhaps even enough to exploit it." Loftus's jaw tightened. "You are out of line, Detective. I am just as eager to find the truth as you are. But accusing me without evidence, that's reckless." Pyne held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned to address the group. "Reckless, perhaps, but in situations like this, it's often the smallest details that reveal the truth." As if to prove his point, Pyne moved toward one of the luggage compartments. His keen eye had noticed something odd, a trail of damp sand leading away from the rack. He reached in and pulled out a pair of socks, heavy and wet, sand spilling out onto the floor. "What in the world?" General Polly muttered, leaning forward to get a better look. "These," Pyne announced, holding up the incriminating evidence, were deliberately planted to implicate someone. Wet sand doesn't end up in socks by accident, does it? The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, suspicion thick in the air. "Who do you think they were meant to frame?" Netta asked, her voice trembling. "That," Pyne said, setting the socks down carefully, "is the kind of question our killer wants us to ask. They're trying to sow discord, make us turn on one another." "And they're succeeding," Loftus muttered, crossing his arms. "This whole thing is a powder keg waiting to explode." Pyne's expression darkened. "Which is exactly why we need to stay calm. The killer thrives on chaos, and we won't give them the satisfaction." As the group tried to process this latest revelation, Pyne turned his attention back to Smethurst's belongings. He rifled through the captain's coat pocket and froze when his fingers brushed against something unusual. Slowly, he pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn and stained. "What is it?" Hensley demanded, craning his neck to see. Pyne unfolded the paper, revealing a cryptic note scrawled in uneven handwriting. "The desert keeps no secrets. Neither do I." The room fell deathly silent. What does that mean?" Netta whispered. Pyne's eyes narrowed as he studied the note. "It means Smethurst knew something worth killing for, and whatever it is, the answer lies in Baghdad." A low rumble of thunder punctuated his words, as if the storm itself was in on the secret. The passengers stared at one another, the lines between friend and foe growing blurrier by the moment. Pyne folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Mark my words," he said, his voice steady and determined. "This killer thinks they're smarter than all of us, but they've made one critical mistake." "And what's that?" Loftus asked, his skepticism clear. "They didn't count on me being here," Pyne replied, his gaze unwavering. The passengers fell silent, the weight of Pyne's words sinking in. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if echoing the storm brewing within the coach. The tension was palpable, and every soul in the room knew one thing: the game had just begun. The final act, the truth unveiled. The coach was eerily silent as Pyne stood, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room. His mind had unraveled the tangled web of deceit, and now it was time to lay it bare for all to see. "Gather around," he commanded, his voice firm but steady, the weight of his words sending a ripple through the group. Each passenger took a seat, the air thick with anticipation, their eyes locked on him. Even Loftus, his demeanor still outwardly composed, couldn't hide the unease beginning to settle in his chest. Pyne glanced at each of them, taking a moment to let the tension simmer before he spoke again. "Captain Smethurst's death was not a random tragedy," Pyne began, his tone deliberate, each word sharp like a scalpel. "It was a calculated, deliberate act." Hensley shifted uneasily in his seat, the sharp glint of suspicion in his eyes. "Calculated? What do you mean, Pyne?" Pyne met his gaze squarely. "I mean the killer was someone who had every reason to silence Smethurst. Someone who had a lot to lose if certain truths came to light." There was a long pause. Pyne could feel the tension building in the room as everyone awaited the revelation. Finally, his eyes locked onto Loftus, visibly sweating, his hand tightening around the armrest. "It was you, Loftus," Pyne said, his voice low but certain. Loftus froze, his face a mask of disbelief, then anger. "What are you talking about?" he spat, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Your real name isn't Loftus," Pyne continued, unfazed. "It's Samuel Long, the infamous financier who disappeared after embezzling millions from investors. You've been hiding under this false identity ever since." A wave of shock rippled through the passengers. General Polly shifted uncomfortably, Netta's hand instinctively clutching her aunt's. But Samuel Long remained silent, his jaw clenched, his face betraying nothing but a cold resolve. Pyne took a step closer, his voice growing more intense. You killed Smethurst because he recognized you, because he knew the truth. You and Smethurst were at Eton together. He knew who you were long. He threatened to expose you, and in the end, you silenced him. Loftus Samuel Long let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing in the confined space of the coach. And what? You think you've figured it all out, detective? His eyes burned with a mixture of resentment and something darker. You think you know the whole story? Pyne didn't flinch. You planted the socks, didn't you? A pathetic attempt to misdirect us, to make us believe someone else was the killer. But I knew better. Long stood up suddenly, his eyes wild, and began to pace back and forth. You think you are so clever, don't you? All of you, he sneered, glancing at the others in the coach. I've spent my life running from the law, from the truth. But in the end, it doesn't matter. The world is full of people like me. Full of betrayal, corruption, and secrets that never stay buried. Pyne watched him carefully, his mind calculating, his every instinct on high alert. You are wrong, Long, he said quietly. The truth always comes out, and when it does, it's always worse than what we fear. Long paused, his eyes narrowing, and for a brief moment there was something vulnerable in his expression, a flicker of regret, or perhaps fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold defiance. You think I am afraid of dying? Long spat, his voice dripping with contempt. I've been living with death at my heels for years. I've made my peace with it. He pulled out a cigarette from his jacket, his fingers trembling slightly, but his expression remained steely. He lit it with a flick of his match, inhaling deeply as he leaned back against the coach's window, his gaze distant. The others watched in silence, the air thick with suspense, as the scent of tobacco filled the small, stuffy space. Then, without warning, Long staggered forward, gasping for breath. His body went rigid as he dropped to his knees, the cigarette falling from his fingers. A collective gasp filled the coach. Poison, Pyne murmured under his breath, already moving toward Long's limp body. His heart raced, but his face remained calm as he knelt beside the fallen man, checking for a pulse. There was nothing. Long was dead. That cigarette, Pyne said, standing up slowly, his gaze sweeping over the group. It was laced with poison. Long didn't want to be taken by the law. He wanted to go on his terms in his own time. The passengers were in shock, some too stunned to speak. Netta's face was pale, her eyes wide, while her aunt seemed to be in a daze, her fingers trembling. Pyne stood tall, his gaze unwavering. He knew his past would catch up with him eventually. But he also knew that in this desert, a man's death could be swallowed whole by the sands. His confession, his death, it's all part of the final chapter of a life lived in hiding. He turned to the rest of the group, his voice cold but filled with a quiet understanding. The desert buries secrets swiftly, but the echoes of betrayal linger forever. As Pyne spoke those words, the storm outside seemed to reach its peak, the wind howling like the voice of the desert itself, and the coach continued its journey toward Baghdad, its passengers forever changed by the dark truths they had uncovered. Climax and resolution, the final journey. The coach rumbled through the barren stretches of the desert, its wheels now steady, as the storm outside began to subside. The once violent winds had died down to a soft whisper, but the tension inside the vehicle remained palpable. The passengers sat in near silence, their faces drawn and weary, each of them forever changed by the events that had unfolded. Pyne sat near the back, his eyes scanning the horizon through the dusty windows. He didn't speak, but his mind raced. The mystery was solved, and yet something about the resolution gnawed at him. There was no satisfaction in the triumph, only a heavy, almost suffocating feeling that lingered like the desert dust settling over their souls. The others were just as silent, lost in their own thoughts. Netta's eyes were fixed on the floor, her face pale as she clutched her aunt's hand tightly. The RAF officers exchanged occasional glances, their expressions betraying the unease that no amount of camaraderie could erase. Even the stoic Hensley, his government ties now irrelevant, appeared uncharacteristically quiet. Pyne let out a quiet sigh and leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting. For all the drama, the deceit, the deadly game that had played out right in front of him, the true cost of it all was hidden beneath the surface. "Do you ever wonder," Pyne said suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness, "if we're all just playing parts in a story written by someone else?" The question hung in the air, a cloud of uncertainty that none of the passengers had the answers to. "Everything we do," Pyne continued, his voice thoughtful, yet laced with a hint of bitterness, "it's all just a series of choices moments that shape us. But in the end, what do we become? Heroes, villains, or just people trying to survive?" Netta, her eyes still downcast, slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. "What's your answer, detective?" she asked quietly, her voice soft, yet tinged with curiosity. Pyne's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't have an answer. That's the problem. We're all walking a thin line. One decision, one mistake, and you can fall into the shadows, never to return." He paused, his eyes flicking to Long's lifeless body, still slumped in the seat where it had fallen. "Or you can stay in the light, pretending the darkness doesn't exist, but it's always there, lurking, waiting for its turn." The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting an ethereal glow across the desert landscape. The coach, now moving slowly but steadily, seemed to glide across the sand, inching toward its final destination, Baghdad. In the midst of the quiet, the harsh reality of what had happened finally began to sink in. They had all been connected, whether they liked it or not, by something far greater than a simple murder. It was about survival. It was about the lengths people would go to protect their secrets, to hide their pasts, and to keep their true selves buried in the sand. Pyne glanced toward the front of the coach, where the driver steered them toward the city's distant skyline. It was almost over. The case was closed. The killer had confessed and died in his own twisted way, leaving nothing but a hollow sense of justice behind. But there was no real victory here, no grand revelation that would change the world, just the quiet realization that, in the end, the desert had won. It had claimed them all in its own way. Their secrets, their betrayals, their lies, none of it would be remembered by anyone but them. The world would keep turning, indifferent to the lives they had lived, the choices they had made. As the coach finally approached the gates of Baghdad, the city's silhouette emerging in the distance, Pyne spoke once more, his voice soft but resolute. "Justice," he murmured, "isn't always as clean as we'd like it to be." There was no answer, only the endless expanse of the desert, slowly fading into the distance as they drew closer to the city. And the haunting echo of the past, a reminder that no one truly escapes the consequences of their actions. As the coach rolled through the city gates, the passengers remained silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, each of them carrying a piece of the desert with them, whether they wanted it or not. "Who do you think the murderer is?"